Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Neil Benezra, Director of San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. It's great to see many people here I don't recognize, and so I especially want to welcome you to our museum. Thursday night the museum is open, so after the talk this evening, don't miss the Via Selman show on the fourth floor, and wonderful exhibition of Brassai, photographer, on the third floor, and the Fisher Collection on 4, 5, and 6. There's a lot to see here, so I take advantage of your visit after the talk. We're thrilled to have you here. The focus tonight, of course, is on China, and absolutely you should not miss the exhibition on the 7th floor, Art in China After 1989, Theater of the World. It's on the 7th floor, as I said, organized by the Guggenheim Museum, and it was shown previous to the showing here in San Francisco at the Guggenheim Bilbao. The title tonight of the program is Learning from China, and it is as you can see very well here, the Morris Series lecture on leadership and innovation. I really want to thank Diane Morris, who's right here in the front row, trustee of the Aspen Institute, longtime friend of this museum. Diane, thank you so much for hosting us this evening. What I want to do now, as quickly as possible, is to pass the word to Alexandra Munroe. Come on up, Alexandra. Alexandra will introduce the panel this evening, and Alexandra, as I think many of you may know, is the Samsung Senior Curator of Asian Art and the Senior Advisor for Global Arts at the Guggenheim Museum. Alexandra is without doubt one of the great authorities on contemporary Asian art anywhere in the world, and she's one of the 3 curators of the exhibition, along with Phil Tinari, who you're about to introduce. So, Alexandra, welcome, and thank you all again for being here.
Thank you very much. Tonight is the final public program around the Art in China After 1989 Theater of the World exhibition. The show concludes its 3-city tour here at SF MoMA on February 24th. So tonight is a little bit poignant. On behalf of Richard Armstrong and the Guggenheim, I offer enormous thanks to Neil, and to our colleagues at SF MoMA, Gary Garrels, Yoonji Ju, and Rudolf Freeling, who were the curators who made the show happen here with such rigorous and clean articulation. I'm sad to say that everyone thinks this is actually the best version of the 3. I also wish to acknowledge our friends Jack and Susie Wadsworth. Their vision prompted this partnership with SF MoMA, and their support, leadership, and encouragement have helped realize the show at every stage of its very long way. Diane Morris also deserves a very special thanks. From the start, the curators never set out to make a survey of contemporary Chinese art or to propose a definitive canon of this movement. Ours is rather a set of propositions about how to think about art and China in relationship to the cultural times we live in. Since the show opened in fall 2017, we have been compelled to rethink this history, our own history that we're presenting, in geopolitical terms as well. Diane's keen interest in this dimension inspired tonight's collaboration with Aspen Institute, so thank you, Diane. So a little background on tonight's panel. Art in China, as you all must know by now, is the largest exhibition of Chinese experimental art ever, and the first survey in a U.S. museum in over 20 years. The show presents a history of contemporary art from China, spanning the watershed dates of 1989 and 2008. The arc of these enormous changes, marking the end of the Cold War, the spread of globalization, and most centrally for our discussion, the rise of China, frames our presentation. With a concentration on the conceptualist art practices of 2 generations of artists, the exhibition examines how Chinese artists, some of them living in China, some of them in Hong Kong, some in Paris, some in New York, some in Germany. This is truly a moment of a global diaspora of Chinese artists who were also thinking of themselves as operators and agents of a larger phenomenon known as global contemporary art. What we're interested in is how these people have been both critical observers as well as agents of this moment of Chinese emergence as a global presence. Critics may argue, and have, about our selection of artists and works, but no one can really argue with our periodization. It may seem obvious now, but as Phil will explain, it was not obvious to us at first. So why these dates, 89 and 2008? Because they are, not so very coincidentally, turning points for China, but also for the world. 1989 marks the end of an era. The Berlin Wall fell, and the post-war order dissolved. In CERN, the internet was developed, unleashing what became known as globalization and the borderless world and all of its promises. In China, a decade of liberal reform was crushed in the Tiananmen June 4th crackdown. Meanwhile, in the arts, in 1989, the Pompidou Center organized its landmark show, Magiciens de la Terre, which announced in its own language the arrival of global contemporary art. And that landmark show included Chinese artists in a global setting for the first time. All three of those artists are now in our show, Huang Yongping, Gu Dexin, and Yang Jieqiang. And actually, without the presence of those Chinese artists, that exhibition could not have rightfully claimed to be a truly global show. For us, coming to 2008 also marks yet another turning point, not only for China, but also for the world. The Olympics game in Beijing occurred as China exactly surpassed to become the world's second largest economy, overtaking Japan, and also a few months later as the global recession hit. Social media around that time transformed the internet, and as the Davos view of globalization began to give way to populist assaults on globalization and its ideology, neoliberalism. Our show argues that many of the conditions that have come to define the 21st century were forged during those 2 decades, and that China was central, not peripheral, to those shifts. Tonight, Phil Tinari will lead our distinguished panel coming from Boston, Beijing, and the Bay Area, our own Berkeley representative, on a discussion really around what's happened since. Phil is Director and Chief Executive Officer of the UCCA Beijing. Since 2011, he has led this institution's transformation from a founder-driven private museum into China's leading independent international institution of contemporary art. UCCA has mounted more than 70 exhibitions and a wide range of public programs, bringing artistic voices, established and emerging, including many artists who are in this exhibition, have staged one-person shows there. But the program is, as well as focusing on Chinese artists, also extremely international. And the audience there has grown to some 1 million visitors a year. A widely published writer and critic, Phil is a contributing editor to Art Forum and was founding editor of that magazine's Chinese edition in 2007. In 2016, he was named a fellow of the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Fluent in Mandarin, my Chinese friends say he speaks better Chinese than they do. And based in Beijing since 2001, Phil holds degrees from Duke and Oxford and is currently completing a doctorate in art history at Oxford. I'm afraid our exhibition has interrupted those studies a little bit. Most significantly, Phil was co-curator with me and Ho Hanru on the exhibition. And it really is sort of bittersweet as we conclude this incredible venture that started at least 5 years ago with conversations in Hong Kong, but really much, much earlier when we first met in the early 2000s and began this larger conversation on what Chinese art means in the world today. So Phil, over to you, and thank you all for coming.
Good evening, and thank you so much for such a generous introduction, Alexandra, and to SF MoMA and the Aspen Institute for having us here tonight. It's really a wonderful way to end the conversation around a show that I think from its very inception has always tried to be about the art, but also about the larger context in which that art was made and to which it speaks at the same time. I want to begin by taking a lead from our friends the Australians, who begin every public event by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, and apologize for our all-male panel tonight, and at the same time to acknowledge that it was, as I think has become clear, Alexandra's vision that really brought this project into the world, and I've been so fortunate to work with her these last 5 years on it every step of the way. And secondly, you may also notice there are no actual Chinese voices on this panel either, which we thought long and hard about. And I think that maybe one rationale we could offer is that we are actually here to talk about learning from China. And this is indeed a panel of people who have come from beyond China, and I think in our work and in our studies have brought something to this conversation, but more importantly, learned something larger from it. So with that out of the way, just to return very briefly to this idea of periodization. Actually, you see on the wall behind you, on the screen behind you, the piece that, it's actually the only new piece in our exhibition, which is of historical contemporary art. This was a commission by the artist Cho Jie that was completed for the exhibition, and which, in his amazing way of mapping, depicts a few things at once. In the background, you'll see the peaks and troughs of Chinese ideology as it unfolded in the years between 1979 and the present. In the foreground, you'll see major international events, and in the middle ground, you see this flowing river that represents the progress of artistic practice in the country through those 4 decades of opening and reform. Excuse me. We decided to end the show in 2008, as Alexandra mentioned, a momentous year, not only because of the Olympics for China, with a moment when it first clearly articulated itself to the world, but because the crisis that happened shortly after the Olympics had come and gone. I actually had the fortune of being with a group of SF MoMA trustees traveling through China the day of the Lehman Brothers collapse, frantically watching them checking their then BlackBerries over a dinner party in Shanghai, actually left China in a much more confident place, having seen the Western liberal model come so close to its own undoing. And another 10 years has elapsed, 11 now, and few would argue that faith in that model is stronger than it was in 2008. Meanwhile, China has enjoyed another extended period of economic growth, alongside, particularly in the years since Xi Jinping's accession to the chairmanship in 2012, an increasingly tight ideological and political climate. Much of the Western commentary on China in the decades following Mao's death in 1976 rested on a basic premise that I've taken to calling, or a lot of us have taken to calling, the great teleology, essentially the idea that economic reform would eventually bring about political openness. And the arguments for this were manifold, that the logic of open markets was incompatible with that of authoritarian politics, that information would destabilize the party's monopoly on truth, that a rising middle class would demand new rights. But then in December, the New York Times, and I won't say the epithet that now goes with the New York Times, in a series that Javier contributed to, published a groundbreaking series called China Rules, and the tagline was, "The world thought it would change China, but China's success has been so spectacular that it has changed the world." Javier's contribution to that series argued that the American dream is alive and well in China. So that's by way of background to the conversation we're about to enter into. I'd now like to introduce our panelists in Confucian order of seniority, starting with Tom Gold, who is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and served for many years, several decades, in fact, as executive director of the Inter-University Program for Chinese Language Studies at Tsinghua University, a program through which two of the three of us, aside from actually Tom, have all been through. It's the training ground from the 60s onward for advanced Chinese language studies for generations of Americans. He did his graduate work at Harvard, where he became one of the 79ers, which was the first generation of U.S. students to live and study in China after the establishment of diplomatic relations, which happened on January 1st of 1979, going to Fudan and Shanghai at a time when that was quite an exotic thing to do. And he sits on the boards of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the Asia Society of Northern California, and the East Bay College Fund. He's been very, very active in Oakland and in the Bay Area for many years. So we're very honored to have you. Javier is a China correspondent for the New York Times based in Beijing. He's been with the Times since 2008, covering City Hall, financial markets, and education from New York through 2014, and then in China since 2015. They made the wise decision to give him a visa. He's been a prolific correspondent, looking mainly at Chinese society and filing on everything from elite politics to the vaccine scandal, LGBT issues to the Me Too movement, and from Xi Jinping's cult of personality to the Chinese machinations of the Kushner companies. With detours towards things like parents who pitch tents to be near their children after they drop them off at college, and a restaurant that's also a shrine to the Taiwanese pop legend Teresa Teng. I really love reading his writing, and I'm so glad that he's here. And finally, last but certainly not least, Julian Gewirtz, who is this year Academy Scholar at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard, his alma mater, everyone's alma mater, and author of a book called Unlikely Partners, Chinese Reformers, Western Economists, and the Making of Global China, which was actually his undergraduate thesis to begin with. He just finished his DPhil at Oxford in history last year as a Rhodes Scholar, served in the Obama administration for a year in the Department of Energy, and in addition to being a historian, he's actually also a poet and a literary critic. So this is quite the panel. I'm excited to jump into this conversation, and we've decided to abolish that traditional sort of opening statement PowerPoint model in favor of questions, which will be sort of directed at individuals, but we hope to have a lively conversation among us and also to be able to allow time to open it up to all of you at the end. And so I wanted to start with Javier, and in fact with this China Rules series, because I feel like this was actually the first time that this had been kind of codified and put out as a position for a larger American landscape, this idea that there might be something to what was going on in China. I mean, one of the other taglines was the land that failed to fail. And I just wanted to hear from the inside, kind of, I know some of us may have listened to Phil Pan on The Daily, but for those of us who didn't, what was the editorial thinking and what was the journalistic process and progress kind of behind such a bold and comprehensive articulation of China now and sort of what it might have to say to all of us?
Sure. Well, thank you, Phil, and thank you to the Museum of Modern Art for hosting us. Thank you all for coming. and to the Aspen Institute. We really appreciate your support and having this opportunity to talk about China. So the China Rules series, which I hope many of you have had the chance to read, really came out of this idea that we're in a different world now. We're at a time when democratic institutions are under attack, when the world is sort of looking at China and saying, how did it go so quickly to this strong position? And what we hope to accomplish through this series was to kind of step back a minute and to tell this story of this rising superpower and how it got to this position, to tell the story of economic reform over the past 40 years, how China's Communist Party defied expectations over and over. It used repression to control society, but at the same time it didn't stifle entrepreneurship and creativity. It used the internet to influence public opinion, but also created this huge environment for innovation and for economic power. At every turn in history, I think, over the past 40 years, people have been surprised by China. And as Phil noted, the conventional wisdom was quite the opposite. So through this series, we explored these assumptions that many people had in the West. And my contribution to this was, one, looking at economic prosperity. When you talk about the prospects for an 18-year-old in the world today, is an 18-year-old in China better off, potentially, or is an 18-year-old in the United States better off? And it's a controversial question, but we looked at some of the economic indicators. And there is an argument to make, I think, that if you're an 18-year-old, you're perhaps better off in China. Income growth is so vast that you're likely to earn more than your parents. Your social station is likely to rise. If you look at life expectancy, it's rising very quickly in China. And just in the sense of optimism, it's always hard to measure public opinion in China for obvious reasons. The government doesn't allow any kind of surveys like that. But people have tried to measure kind of how do Chinese see their lives? Do they think their children will be better off than they were? And overwhelmingly, people say yes, something like 80% or more, compared to 30 or 40% in the United States now. So it led to this idea that perhaps the American dream is alive in China, more so at least than it is in the United States, where parents and children, their prospects aren't as good as many expected at this stage. So through this series, we kind of explored that relationship between China's rise and its people's economic prospects, and then also just the fact that we're intertwined in ways that people don't realize. The United States and China now are so intermingled and dependent on each other. And so as we enter this new era under President Trump and President Xi, and the tensions that have arisen, we kind of step back and think, is China's success a threat to the U.S.? In what ways? If China fails, is that a threat to the U.S.? In what ways? And I think both are possibly true, that whether China succeeds or fails will have drastic consequences for the United States. And so that was the series' hope, to kind of explain this new world, this emerging new world order, and to tell it in a way that really brought people, to the lives of these families in the countryside, people in the city, people overseas where China's influence is being felt, and to piece together this fascinating history of one of the most dramatic tales, I think, of this century and the last century, China's rise.
Thanks. Did either of you read that series or have thoughts on it?
Certainly. So, I thought the series did an extraordinarily comprehensive job of covering a country that is so often profiled or written about in small slices. The scale of China, 1.4 billion people, massive landmass, many thousands of years of history, often I think makes the desire to be comprehensive feel impossible. And I thought the series did a really extraordinary job of giving, in a lot of words, a way of getting a kind of comprehensive introduction.
It was, I think, over 25,000 words in the end, all the different pieces, but it was among the most widely read of our stories last year. So that was very inspiring, because as you all know, it's very difficult to get people to engage with issues concerning China in a deep and sustained way. And that was one of our goals, was to get audiences interested in China and people to move beyond these stereotypes I mean, I'm sure you've encountered in your academic life that you'll often find that critics either latch onto you for being anti-communist party, or they say you're too kind to China.
And often both, I would imagine. You probably get emails in both directions all the time.
So we're really hoping to change the conversation, or at least bring it to a different level.
Yeah, I would echo what Julian said, and I would also hope that you publish it separately as a monograph, because it'd be great for teaching, either a course on Chinese, contemporary China, or a China segment of some larger course on economic development, globalization, social change. And I would also add that the photographs were extraordinary, that it really brought, in addition to the prose, it really brought home the lives of a lot of the people that you were talking about.
I think it was definitely, I think, a landmark in the conversation, just in terms of coherently putting forth a new framework for thinking about China right now that's surpasses that earlier kind of batch of common wisdom. I'm curious, because Tom is the person on the panel with the longest experience with China. You first lived and worked there in 1979. You've seen the time when foreigners were using foreign exchange certificates, were not allowed to use the normal currency of the people, and you've also written over and over again about, well, not over, but many times about youth, about different generations, and how generations articulate themselves and see themselves and understand themselves in relation to their historical experience. I was looking at a talk you did about sort of 5 distinct generations going back to the people who came of age with the revolution. And I guess I was curious from your perspective, how you see this younger generation kind of understanding itself in relation to their parents, their grandparents, and this vast set of changes that have happened in these lifetimes.
Well, actually, the year I was there, we did not use foreign exchange certificates. They were introduced in 1979, but we didn't have them. What we did have was ration coupons. If you can, I would assume most everyone here has been to China and been to Shanghai, sister city of San Francisco. And it's hard to believe that when I was a student, we would be issued on a regular basis ration coupons for grain and for cotton. And if you would go to a restaurant and order rice or noodles, you ordered by how many ounces. And then you had ounce by ounce coupons that you would give in addition to money. And if you would go buy cotton clothes in a store, it was also by how many meters of cotton you were buying. So it's another sort of aspect of the rapidity of change. When I was a student at Fudan in 1979, I was with there were already 2 major types of students and 3 major types of students who were there as undergraduates. During the Cultural Revolution, to get higher education, you had to prove your redness, your political reliability. So the students at the university were known as the worker, peasant, soldier students, that they were taken from factories, from the countryside, and from the military, and had proven to the satisfaction of the person who signed the slip, of course a lot of it was performative, that they were reliable and they could go to college. In 1977, 77, they reintroduced the Gaokao, the college entrance exam, which had been stopped during this political period. So at Fudan at that time, there were, in addition to the worker, peasant, soldier students, there were students who had gotten in through their ability to take tests. Now that included, there was an upper age, maybe at that first time there was no upper age limit on the ability to qualify to take that test. So my first semester, my roommate was a 19-year-old high school graduate who took the test from Beijing and got into Fudan. The second semester, my roommate was a 30-year-old college freshman who had spent 10 years out of school as an accountant in the countryside, as a worker, and as a teacher. So you had these 3 very distinct groups of students at the university all at the same time. And there were actually fistfights between the worker, peasant, soldier types and the Gaokao types who said, you're illegitimate. You really don't belong in a university. You only got in because you were able to convince or bribe some guy that you were read and that you could qualify for it. So at that time, especially the ones who were 30-year-old college freshmen, were unbelievable in terms of their determination to make up for 10 years of lost time. They're referred to in China as the China's lost generation. And they said, for 10 years, I had to do all of this stuff. I really understood a lot about China that had been hidden from us, especially city dwellers, because we knew so little about the countryside. But spending 10 years as a peasant, 10 years as a soldier, 10 years as a worker, we really understood how China operated and the truth behind all of the propaganda. And we don't believe any propaganda at all anymore. But we are going to take every opportunity that's been given to us now to make up for those 10 lost years and to contribute as much as we possibly can to this new era, because this was right at the beginning. When I arrived 40 years ago this month, was just a month and a half, 2 months after the landmark third plenum of the 11th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. It sounds better in Chinese than it does in English. But it was this landmark where under Deng Xiaoping's leadership, not official leadership, but he was the paramount figure behind the scenes, they shifted the focus of their work away from political struggles to the four modernizations of agriculture, industry, science, technology, and national defense. And they were trying to really play down all of this ideological infighting because they said that didn't get us anywhere. That's why we're so poor now. And they began to open up slowly to knowledge about the outside world as another way of motivating these students to say, look how far behind China has fallen. You have to really work hard. If you work hard, we're going to play down the political aspect and let you achieve your full potential. So just at that, I mean, this is already 3 different cohorts or groups of people given this new window, this new opportunity. And there was a great deal of excitement and optimism on a part of a lot of these young people for what they could contribute to the country and what its possibilities were.
Julian, you've thought a lot about this generation as well, I think, and especially about the kinds of economic thinkers who were part of that conversation in those early days of reform. Could you tell us a little bit about that debate as it unfolded, and do you think that there is that same kind of pluralism in the conversation now?
Sure. So the dynamics that Tom was just describing are fascinating to dig into even deeper, because they really sort of exemplify the fact that at this time, China felt profoundly behind. The feeling was that after a decade of Cultural Revolution chaos and a variety of other experiments with different forms of socialism, some more successful than others, some, like the Great Leap Forward, disastrous, that China had really lost its way, and that figuring out the way forward was going to require learning from all around the world, from countries on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And so, as I began, not having had the opportunity to be there myself, as I began digging into this history, I was just stunned by the extent of the openness. We often think today, accurately I think, of the Chinese Communist Party as quite closed to foreign influences, having some degree well-earned confidence, but also a lack of interest in studying carefully other foreign models and applying them to China. In the 1980s, this was radically different. They invited figures ranging from socialist reformers to Milton Friedman. The encounters that they were willing to have stretched far beyond official orthodoxy. And they really mattered. This was not just for show, it was deeply substantive. To the second part of your question, I have to say the degree of openness, pluralism, dynamism, and intellectual debate is certainly much narrower. Some of this goes back to post-1989, to use your periodization for the show, a turn that was taken after the crackdown, where the sense was that actually these kinds of interactions with the wider world had gotten out of hand. But I also think a lot of it does have to do with Xi Jinping and his particular approach to governance, emphasizing the central leadership of the Party, loyalty, and also feeling that China, the China model, has a degree of validity, historical correctness, as he likes to put it, that even 15 years ago was not apparent to the Chinese leadership. So now when I go to China or when I read the writings of Chinese intellectuals, you can see a intense negotiation with what is politically possible. I'd also just add that one of the really key issues at the heart of the current debate about China's future is what the content of the China model is. Whether, for instance, state-owned enterprises, the legacies of socialism, have helped China, have been part of the reason for its success, or whether that success has happened in spite of those things. The Chinese Communist Party today, I think, believes quite strongly that it knows the answer to that it is the mixed system, that as you wrote about the recent trip that Xi Jinping took to the south to talk to private entrepreneurs was preceded by a trip to the north to talk to the heads of state-owned enterprises. So these deliberately mixed signals and this deliberately mixed system, I think, are both really critical parts of how the Chinese Communist Party sees the diminishing value of being open to debate and new ideas.
And just to understand this, I think it's really important to understand Xi Jinping and who he is, because when he came into office, there were so many expectations that he was going to liberalize, that he might open up, and that was markedly wrong. And I think in learning more about him, you really need to understand that he's, the son of Communist Party royalty, a revolutionary leader. He is somebody who endured the Cultural Revolution in a very brutal way, and who I think innately fears any kind of opening up of Chinese society, fears large masses, fears kind of any kind of democratic movement. And he's somebody, I think, that insecurity, I think, is at the center of his governance style and of the party's governance now. This fear that if they were to offer even any, morsel of democratic freedom, that it would backfire and result in the party losing its power, its preeminence, and to force people like Xi Jinping out of office. And so they've really doubled down on authoritarianism. That's been the hallmark of my time there since 2014. And you can feel it and see it on the streets of Beijing and elsewhere, I think.
Well, one thing that I think is really important to realize about China is how many levels of reality it operates on. So yes, Xi Jinping is narrowing the space for political debate and for dissent at one level, but at another level, at a private level, people talk about anything. And I'm not sure if you were going to talk about the internet later, but certainly people, even though there are all these restrictions on access to the global web, Chinese find a way of getting around it. One skill I found about with most of the Chinese, certainly young people I know, is they figure out, okay, here's what the rules are, now how do I get around them? And they're very good at sort of sussing that sort of thing out. So I found that people, I'm shocked by the sort of political comments that people will make in private, assuming that I'm not going to tell, but also hearing them discuss it with each other. It's not just a question of taking advantage of me as a foreigner and getting something off their chest. So that these two levels, and Xi Jinping is quite right to fear that, because there is this communication not only one-on-one, but also through the internet. Now that, Weixin, Weibo, sort of Chinese WeChat, they try to monitor that as much as they possibly can. But it's just astounding how much still gets through.
I just want to add, though, that while all of that is certainly true, I have been really astonished at the extent to which erasing the past, controlling historical memory of the exact events you were describing a few moments ago, that has been successful. There's a very popular Chinese television show right now which is about someone in exactly that class going to university, and he has political background problems. And if you go and watch the video online, it's very popular in China to have kind of real-time comments. And the real-time comments about this moment at the end of the Cultural Revolution are primarily total confusion and sort of shock at the idea that he wouldn't be able to go to college for these set of reasons. And what that fundamentally reveals in a society where you don't have opinion polling as deep as we'd like, is that there is an erasure of this history. And so many of the things that we're talking about as somehow definitional to contemporary China are not as widely known as many of us might think.
As they say in Hamilton, who lives, who dies, who tells your story, right? And in China, the Communist Party wants to be able to tell the story. And one thing that at Berkeley we've had now, lots and lots of Chinese undergraduates who come get degrees or they spend a semester. And when I've been teaching contemporary Chinese society, most of the students in the class are from mainland China. And I have to tell them what is, all of Chinese contemporary history, recent modern history, but in terms of what is the Great Leap Forward, is the Cultural Revolution, going down to the countryside, Tiananmen, all of these sort of things. And I remember, this was in an earlier period, but I had a Chinese student come to me and he said, I called my parents and I said, did you ever hear about this Cultural Revolution? Did you know what Red Guards were? He said, well, I think maybe my grandpa was a Red Guard. So that this historic erasure, your terminology is really very good, is something that, it's quite striking, especially the role of, but throughout Chinese history, the question of who lives, who dies, who tells your story, the first thing that a new dynasty does is to tell the story of the previous dynasty, why it failed, and why we're going to live forever, we're going to be in power forever, that we're not going to fail. And that's another reason that the Communist Party leadership reads the Ancien Régime by de Tocqueville, and they also study the experience of the Soviet Union so that we will never make those mistakes.
Yeah, China is in many ways the original post-truth society, right? There's a controlling of the parameters of the conversation inside of which many things happen that makes all kinds of forms of thought and conversation almost impossible. One interesting angle is, has there been, what have been the good things that have happened, in this Xi Jinping era? I have this kind of pet theory. The corruption crackdown, which began in 2012, began at a moment when the party was kind of had left the state in such a state of endemic corruption that something needed to be done, right? If we think that the party's only governing logic is self-preservation, actually things had kind of reached a point where rectifying that was necessary to continue to justify rule moving forward. Interestingly, and this is maybe too anecdotal, this is certainly not grounded in actual sociological research, but it does seem that in the years since, we've seen a shift away from kind of social capital and status being based on one's proximity to the party state and the almost hereditary elite towards the valorization of people like Jack Ma, Pony Ma, Kai Fu Lee, the kind of great entrepreneurs. And I feel like on some level those things may be connected, like that actually the anti-corruption campaign opened a space for a sort of heroics of entrepreneurship that wasn't there before. I'd be curious if you think there's anything to that.
I think it's true to a certain extent, but I also, you look at somebody like Jack Ma and he, stepped away from Alibaba. Some have theorized that's because he was worried he was getting too famous and too worshipped. There are people in China who have posters of Jack Ma in their homes and kind of idolize him in the same way they might somebody like Mao Zedong. So I think there's a limit to that status, and I think the party is very careful to not allow these other heroes to emerge. But you're right that there is this sort of entrepreneurial class now that's worshipped, and even if you're a teacher or even if you're a factory worker, you still look up to these people. They are model Chinese citizens. But in terms of Xi Jinping's era, you're right, the anti-corruption campaign has been very successful, especially in local areas. Some people say that at higher levels, Xi has used it to sideline his enemies, political enemies. But I think you're right that there's a sense that he is, true or not, that he's improved the meritocracy in China. But I think there is that still the party obviously is still in the way of a lot of innovation and kind of egalitarianism, and people feel that. I was just a couple of weeks ago talking to some workers in southern China, and as you were saying, they say what's on their minds. They don't hold back. And they were just railing against the corruption among local officials in China and how they were colluding with the factory bosses to exploit them and to cut their pay. And I think there is a lot of anger when you get farther down still at the party and corruption there. But it's improved, I think, at a lot of levels.
Yeah, I mean, my thinking about corruption in China always begins with a feeling that corruption has been an inextricable part of the economic reforms from the beginning. I mean, the students in 1989, one of the things that they were protesting was official corruption. As market incentives expanded, officials who were in a mixed system, a socialist market economy, had the ability to use their political power to make quite a great deal of money for themselves or for other people who they wanted to favor. What we don't know, and I think the Xi Jinping era is attempting to be a real-time experiment in, is whether China can continue to grow without corruption, whether corruption has been a greasing of the wheels in addition to the many negative things that it is. Many reports, for instance, have indicated that officials without the guideposts of corruption and without the incentives of corruption have pulled back from some of the activities, many of which were positive. On the issue of entrepreneurs, I think, of course, an entrepreneur who is seen as not corrupt is a very useful figure, especially if that person, as in Jack Ma's case, is a member of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that when I think about Chinese entrepreneurs, I always am curious, how close and how far do they actually stand? And how much can we see an entrepreneur as someone who is outside of a party-state system? And how much should we actually understand them as somehow a part of it?
You've raised so many, I have several hours worth of lecture to give on that. But certainly one of the things that struck me in living in Shanghai, and I keep having to go back to that, is what we can call suppressed entrepreneurship. Is when I went to Shanghai as a language student, I had just come off a year in Taiwan doing my doctoral dissertation research on basically the emergence of capitalism and the bourgeoisie in Taiwan. And you have one of the important keys to Taiwan's development was the role of overseas Chinese. And we know that in Taiwan and throughout Southeast Asia and in San Francisco, so much of the entrepreneurial class is dominated by overseas Chinese who left China because the atmosphere there was so unconducive to entrepreneurship. So it's not a question of lack of entrepreneurship, but the way that the larger system suppressed it. So one of the things that was really striking in Shanghai, especially having just come from Taiwan, where the first class of entrepreneurs after the nationalist government went there were Shanghainese refugees, and Hong Kong's first class of entrepreneurs, also Shanghainese refugees, was that the way that people complained. I became a real Shanghai chauvinist after living there for a year, and I can't really get it out of my system. But they said, if it wasn't for those peasants in Beijing who were running this country, we'd really be able to grow. And it really wasn't until Pudong in 1992, when Pudong really started to take off, that Shanghai realized its potential. And people would say, the sun is finally coming out in Shanghai. But one of the other words you used that I wanted to pick up on was experimenting. That one of the things that's so surprising and striking about the Chinese Communist Party is most Leninist parties, modus operandi is suppression, is control. But the Communist Party under Deng's leadership, and this is the sort of thing that you've written about, decided to just back off and let's see what happens. And so they selected the experimental economic zones, Shenzhen on the Hong Kong border most noticeably, and things went really great. I said, well, this is good. We can do this. And one of the other things they did was to take the lid off micro entrepreneurship, because they felt that you look at Taiwan's economy dominated by small micro entrepreneurs. We could do that, and Taiwan has still had an authoritarian regime. What do we have to worry about? And so that it just blew up much faster and much more broadly than they had ever anticipated. And in the 90s, I think there was a lot of talk about China was like the US wild, wild west. There were no rules. So it went on for a while, and then they suddenly decided this is getting out of control. The corruption has to be stopped. And it wasn't just at these small entrepreneurs, but it was rising all the way through the Communist Party. But it's astounding the way that they tolerated this sort of thing for so long. And can you put the cat back in the bag?
Thanks. I think one area, we don't have too much time left, but one area that I think we should touch on, especially because it's just so key to this whole conversation, is the internet. And there, back to this original proposition. I mean, there was this idea that the internet would be China's undoing. Was it Bill Clinton who said, the two
Can't nail Jello to a wall.
Right? Things are incompatible. Right, and weirdly, what we've kind of discovered in this strange moment in which we find ourselves of trolls and memes and fake news and psychographic targeting, is that, as Javier argued in one of our preparatory conversations, internet control can be good or can be useful in certain ways. And so I'm just curious, if you think that this might be an area in which there is something to be, if not learned, at least appreciated or understood in this model, and then also, I guess, more generally, if there are others.
Just to be clear, I mean, I think that there are a lot of people who think internet control can be good, in this era of fake news, and there's an argument to be made, but it can also be bad in a lot of ways, and that's clearly on display, and we've seen all of that in China, especially when it's used. I mean, the Communist Party doesn't use internet control just to get rid of fake news or to avoid political interference. They use it to basically whitewash anything that has any criticism of the party, anything about Xi Jinping, anything about Tiananmen Square, et cetera. But the ultimate point, I think, is that there's a lot of questions right now in democratic societies about whether there has been too much free expression or too much openness on the internet, and it's a valid question. I don't think anyone really knows yet, especially those who really believe deeply in the value of free expression, whether anything should change. Certainly, building a system like China's anywhere in the world would be incredibly complex, and people, hundreds of and thousands of people are human censors in China right now, and I don't think anyone in the United States would ever support anything like that, nor should they necessarily. But I think there is this sense that Facebook is beginning to look at this. How can we better control the online environment so that stuff that's actually true and has value gets a bit more play than stuff that's obviously intended to deceive. But these conversations are just beginning, I think, and it's hard to know where things will land. One thing to know about China, though, is people don't always realize within China that their internet is censored to the extent that it is. I remember being once in the countryside and having a taxi driver turn to me and ask, "Is it really true that there are things we don't know about that are not being told to us, that our government isn't allowing us to see?" That's something he had heard, but he wasn't even entirely certain about. And so people are very content in some ways with what they have in China. The internet in China is as vibrant a place as it is in the United States. You still have your cat videos, your goofy pranks. People are very satisfied with
and a whole economy of online to offline services rendered.
Exactly, and you wouldn't realize that it's censored if you were a Chinese citizen. So it's a really tough question to grapple with, and I think people are beginning in the United States, especially, to think about this and how the online environment can be improved.
Yeah, from my perspective, the Chinese internet looks very different from where you stand in China. I think that's one of the things that comes out of what you just said. If you're a millennial in Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen, the Chinese internet is a thrilling space where you can get almost anything delivered to your doorstep. If you're a Uyghur in Xinjiang, the Chinese internet is a place where your activities are surveilled constantly, and it is a way in which the state's techno-authoritarianism comes into your home or your conversations with your most intimate friends and loved ones. So all of this has sort of led me to feel that maybe there isn't really just one Chinese internet. Maybe there are many different Chinese internets that we need to think about, and maybe the geography of the Chinese internet, well, I mean, if you can use WeChat Pay or Alipay in a taxi cab in New York, then the Chinese internet may be already in our own society. And thinking through the implications of that is very difficult when you realize that China has been attempting, yes, to build a great firewall in that wonderful phrase, but it's also been a process of exporting elements of that, some of which are very positive. I sometimes buy books off Taobao, a Chinese site, and some of which are very negative.
Yeah, on the One China Many Internets, there was a wonderful documentary that played in San Francisco, or played in the Bay Area month or so ago, called The People's Republic of Desire, by a Chinese and a US-based Chinese documentary filmmaker, but it was about live streaming. And it's about how these young people make very nice livings off of live streaming, and all of these mostly very lonely people. A lot of them are rural migrants who've moved to the cities. Their whole life now is based on following and sending gifts to these people who just, perform in front of the on the internet. So, which of course, that from the government's point of view, that's a distraction. People aren't thinking about politics. And that's something else. We tend to think of the internet. Oh, people can, or cell phones as they're communicating. They're starting a revolution. They want democracy. Whereas a lot of them just want to shop, and they want to follow their favorite live streamer.
Great. As a sort of concluding question, I mean, we titled this panel "Learning from China" out of a feeling that there are aspects of China's rise that have been misunderstood, misinterpreted, or simply ignored in our mainstream American conversation. So maybe just quickly, what are there specific areas where China's model has been unambiguously successful, or where it might leave the U.S. behind? What are the lessons that other countries have drawn from China in the period since 2008, and might there be anything there for the U.S.? It's just a small question to end on. We have. I think we're almost out of time before we open it up.
I would just. I would say that there's been this awakening now that's important to understand, and I think that's important for countries like the United States to consider, which is that we always kind of assumed that the world would be shaped by the United States, and for decades that was true. And now it's changed, and it's important now to acknowledge and to understand how China is shaping the world. And it's shaping the world in good ways, some might argue. There's been this incredible reduction in poverty in China. So many, hundreds of millions of people have risen out of poverty. And perhaps China has lessons to share with the world about how that occurred. It's been negative, some might argue, in that back to internet control. You have companies now that have to bend over backwards to please the Chinese Communist Party in order to gain market access. So companies like Apple, will delete apps that are considered sensitive, including the New York Times, in their Chinese app store. Google, there are rumors that they are considering a censored version of their search engine again in China. But I think what the fundamental idea is that we're in this new era where we need to really think about China's goals and interests, and think about the United States and other countries' goals and interests, and to understand that China is here to stay, that this isn't something that we can just ignore anymore. And so the more that people learn about China, the more that Chinese learn from Americans and Americans learning from Chinese, I think the better we can kind of manage this period where there are huge risks of conflict and confrontation.
Yeah, on the aspect of your question about learning from China, to me, I think one of the hardest things for Americans to wrap our heads around is the fact that this is not always going to be a story of a powerful China imposing its will on other countries, that just as part of the story of China's rise has been about its own agency, its desire to reach out and learn, there are many countries that want to do that with China. And for the United States, a real challenge is how do we look at a country that's doing that, let's say a country in sub-Saharan Africa, and encourage the elements that are good, that we deem good, and at the same time realize that there are aspects of China's model, particularly its sort of technologically enabled authoritarianism, that would be, I think, very, very upsetting and very negative if they were exported broadly around the world. That's a real challenge for policymakers, and I think one of the problems in the present moment is it's very difficult to understand which aspects of the so-called China model are of interest to developing countries, or whether they want the whole thing, top to bottom.
Well, Xi Jinping's goal is to make China great again, right? That it's the whole road to rejuvenation. It's to erase the century, now a century and a half of humiliation, and to make China, make it possible for China to rise back to the level where it was the center of the universe. And I think the China model is very attractive to many developing countries because of some of the themes that we've addressed. Is this issue of a dynamic, marketized, globalized, but not complete and privatized, in degrees, economy with a strong authoritarian leader, or either an individual or a party or a military junta. And what we've seen is this distressing trend in the world in the last decade or so of the revival of populism, authoritarian nostalgia, crackdown on all sorts of domestic dissent. And I don't know that the Chinese are, what relation the Chinese have to this, but I think that the fact that if they bring leaders from around the world to China and they see this, they see the gleaming cities and the trains run on time and that sort of thing, it's very attractive. And the Chinese have a good story to tell. And I think one of the things that they also emphasize is building alliances and investing in education and learning foreign languages and the sort of things that I think, if you want to talk about learning, I think one of the things that our government could certainly do is put more money into a lot of basic research, foreign language training, study abroad, these kinds of things to win over hearts and minds.
Just on the lessons of China, I think it's also important to note that one of the grimmer lessons of China right now is this mass detention of Uyghurs in Western China, in Xinjiang. And that has profound implications, I think, for how other governments, if they adopt the China model, deal with these minority populations. And it's a story that China doesn't often like to talk about, but it's an important story. And the surveillance techniques that are being used there, will and are being used elsewhere in China and elsewhere in the world. So that's been sort of a darker legacy now that China has risen, and it's an important one to address.
We don't have time to go into it, but certainly environmental degradation is another key area. And the Chinese certainly believe in science and believe that climate change is real. And on the policy level, they have a lot of policies to deal with it. Whether or not they're being implemented consistently or from all the way at the bottom level is another issue. But I think that's something else that it's something that needs to be taken into consideration in terms of what can you learn from China.
All right, the inevitability of climate change ending the whole conversation is always a place to end. But we do actually have some time for questions from the audience, so I think there's a microphone to be delivered around. Yeah. You're next.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for all being here, Javier and all the panelists. I have a question. Javier, by the way, I thought your pieces were very well written and very thoughtful. So I'm very concerned about China as a world actor, and I'm very concerned about their foreign policy, and I'm concerned about how they're interacting with liberal democracies, including our own, and my concerns about intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, South China Seas, and the state, the current state, and how they're interacting in the world and with the U.S. What would your advice be to the U.S. or other Western countries, and how to influence China today to have them be a better actor since they've been in the WTO? I mean, I don't think anyone on both sides of the aisle would argue that they haven't. They've worked the system in a way where there's definitely been a massive transfer of wealth having to do with cyber and other things as well. So how would you advise, our leaders today to deal with China?
I can provide some analysis. It's not my position to advise, but my sense is that there's this profound lack of understanding between the two nations, and I think it's actually skewed in one direction, which is that Chinese leaders and diplomats have been obsessed with and studying the United States for decades, And the same is not true in the American government. You know, it's actually been difficult to find very seasoned veteran diplomats and business leaders, et cetera, who actually understand China and how China works. And so China is very transactional. And I think in these trade talks and these negotiations, one of the hardest parts has been that the United States is seeking these very big and substantial changes, and China wants to know what it will get in return. And there's not a clear answer. I think there's on both sides there's sort of this give and take over fairly minor issues. So I don't think there's an easy solution, and I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon. I think this is going to be a protracted dispute that involves this clash of cultures and this misunderstanding and lack of understanding. But I think the Chinese side, even for us who live there and study, it's very difficult to understand sometimes what they would be willing to accept, what they want, and to understand. It seems from the outside, at least, that Xi Jinping is in charge and that he's driving policy. But we don't get interviews with Xi Jinping. We don't get interviews with party leaders. We don't know. There's no transparency. So from our perspective, it's just a matter of trying to suss out through the media, et cetera, what China wants and where China is headed. But I think they're happy to kind of see this protracted dispute go on over these minor issues. It gives them more time. They think America's in decline, that this, eventually America will be forced to kind of succumb to Chinese demands. But whether that happens or not, we'll see. It's one of the things that people don't always address is that China's rise is inevitable, but the United States is going out of its way now to try to combat what it sees as unnecessary Chinese influence and lack of transparency in international institutions. The U.S. is having some success so far, I think, in really frightening China in some areas. So can the U.S. actually mitigate some of those effects and still build alliances? I don't know. It sort of depends, but you guys might have.
One or two more.
And for the last 25 years or so, I've thought that the United States would be Athens to China's Rome. And I wonder whether, and I mean it in the full sense of the word, I mean in the historical sense, that Rome took over the world and that Athens was the idea factory. What is your comment on that?
You're the historian.
I think that's a fascinating analogy. I think so the standard thing that we've been used to hearing about is about Athens and Sparta as the sort of analogy for China and the United States, a rising power that causes fear in the established or status quo power. The political scientist Graham Allison has thought and talked about this as the so-called Thucydides trap. The analogy is very interesting, though, because in that case, Rome saw itself as an inheritor to the legacy of the sort of Grecian traditions, the classical traditions. I think that one of the things I hope has come out of this panel is that, yes, China is willing to adapt or interpret elements of what we have been doing in the United States, our visions of modernization, industry, capitalism, etc., but they view themselves as having a wholly distinct civilizational lineage. And as a result, I can't imagine that if such a succession happens in 200 or 300 years, I hope it won't, but if it does, I can't imagine that they would put up the sort of same kind of, form of homage that Rome paid to Athens. I think it will be a very different world order with very different values at its core.
That's great. I think we have time for maybe one last question, one or two.
Well, what would Mao think of China today?
I think I haven't been to the Mao Mausoleum in Beijing in many years, but I assume that every morning they have to flip him back over. I think he would be absolutely horrified that his vision for what China should be like, and China's domestically as well as China's role in the world, has completely been overturned, and that would not like what he sees today. His definition of modernization was very different from, I think, what we've seen now.
Right. I think the only thing that he would be happy with is the fact that China is so powerful. And at the core of Mao's view of the world, as radically different as it was from what has propelled China's rise, was a desire to see China, as you said, become the center of the world again. But I think he would then become extremely upset that it happened in the way that it did.
And of course, it's still led by the Communist Party. He'd be happy about that, even though he tried to purge it, right? And it's the people on the capitalist road are the ones who've been victorious.
Right. And maybe the third thing he'd be happy about is that his portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Square.
I mean, I think we also need to acknowledge that maybe one of the reasons why China could have the present that it has is because of what happened in those 30 lost years, i.e. the creation of a single national public, right? I mean, think about there wasn't even a standard language, being spoken. There wasn't a unitary ideological framework. I always think that there's this great irony that actually what Mao might have done is created the world's largest, essentially, docile labor force to participate in this capitalist revolution.
Well, one of the things that drives the leadership of the Communist Party is the first sentence of the classic novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And I always get the order wrong, but it's basically those which have long been separated must come together. Those which have long been together must fall apart. And what Mao, I agree with you, Phil, that what the achievement of the Communist Party was uniting a country which had been torn apart by warlordism, by foreign invasion, by Western imperialism, and uniting it. The Chinese people have stood up. And that's one of the things that drives Xi Jinping too. And the leadership of the Communist Party is preserving this idea of unity. And the way that they treat minorities, such as the Uyghurs and Tibetans and religious people and so on, is that they feel that their goal is to, if they were able to achieve what their goals are, that China would fall apart again. And that has to be avoided at all costs.
One of the most ironic stories I've been writing about the past couple of months is that there are these young Maoists in China, and they are determined to reclaim his glory and to say that China has become too capitalist now, and that the party is no longer Marxist or Maoist in its ideology. It's succumbed to foreign Western influences. And of course, Xi Jinping has responded by arresting these students. These radical leftists. It's now wrong to be an ardent young communist in China, which is one of the great ironies of history. The party that claims itself to be Marxist and Maoist is now one of the great capitalist societies.
I think that's as good a place as any to call it Stevie. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
So I just want to thank our panel. Thanks, Phil, the panel. Thanks, the museum, Neil, and all the staff, and of course, Diane. We have two more upcoming Morris Series lectures, one on March 5th and one on May 22nd. So you're on our list now, so please look out for those invitations. And thank you again for coming. I know the traffic was terrible, so we were happy that you all made it. And this will be recorded, and I will send it out to everyone who came tonight, so feel free to pass it along, and it will also be on our Aspen Institute channel. So thank you again.